All right, so welcome to another workshop offered by the University of Kentucky Office of Work Life and Benefits. Today we're going to be talking about parenting is imperfect, and we're going to be taking some advice and notes and considerations from the book The Gifts of Imperfect Parenting by Brene Brown. If you're familiar with Brene Brown, you know she's been around for a while and she has done a lot of good books. She's offered some great advice to us on how to be brave and just how to live authentic lives in this world. So here's what we're going to cover. Again, we're going to pull some advice from the audiobook, The Gifts of Imperfect Parenting. We're going to discuss some of the guideposts that are covered in that book. And then we're going to just kind of talk about some considerations, things for you to consider when it comes to your own parenting. So, a few guideposts that we're going to cover today. She has quite a few. We're not covering them all because this session is designed to be sort of a quick snapshot of some of the information, not all that's covered in this audiobook. There will be a three-part series in the spring of 2025. You're welcome to join that session and kind of walk through in more detail. But today, here's the topics that we're going to cover. We're going to talk about cultivating worthiness in our families, shame versus guilt, vulnerability, and love and belonging. So here's a few kind of obvious points, but sometimes food for thought. The most powerful and meaningful moments with our children happen in imperfect moments. Imperfect moments. So this pretty much reminds us that, when we are parenting and sometimes we're trying to be so perfect in front of our children and we're trying to present the perfect life for them and everything going right, nothing going wrong. But in this book, she makes the point that really the most powerful like teaching moments sometimes and even powerful, more meaningful, memorable times that we have with our children are the times when things don't go right. I always like to say that usually you remember things more when something goes wrong or things don't go as planned. You tend to remember your weekend when things don't go as planned. We've all had that time when someone asked on Monday morning, "What did you do this weekend?" And you have to pause and you're like, "What did I do?" And sometimes you're like, "It must have been okay because I don't remember anything." And then there are other times when you're like, "Oh my gosh, this happened, that happened, this." And sometimes it's good stuff and sometimes it's not. So this just reminds us that sometimes instead of us trying to create this perfect world for our children, just be reminded that those imperfect moments are so meaningful and powerful because oftentimes they become teachable moments and they become moments for you to be vulnerable. It becomes moments for you to even connect with your child in a very meaningful way. Another point here says a lot of parenting spaces filled with how do we raise these perfect children? And then here's the point. Most of us are in our homes just trying to do the best we can. Just that simple. We're just trying to do the best we can from one day to the next, from one season of our lives and our children's lives to the next. And sometimes doing the best you can is 80%, and sometimes it's 100, sometimes it's 50. So we all, have different capacities from day to day. So it just reminds us that it's okay to be doing the best you can because of course there's no instruction guide for real and there's no rule book on how to be a perfect parent. There's all, well, shall I say it this way? There's all kinds of books you can buy about parenting this, parenting that, and a lot of them are very helpful. But at the end of the day, you are living your life with your child or your children, and you know the challenges that you face. You know the ups and the downs that you face. You know the scheduling conflicts and everything else that's happening in your life. And because of that, you have to figure out what makes sense and what works for you and your family. So that's where she's kind of making a point of, you know what? We're all just trying to do the best we can. So there's no such thing as a perfect parent. And in fact, in the book, she makes the point that I kind of feel like that's an oxymoron. There's no way you can be a perfect parent. It's just impossible because you're going to make mistakes because we're all human and nobody's perfect. So even if you're doing really great this day or this week or this morning, you might do something in the afternoon and you think, oh gosh, why did I say that? Why did I do that? Why didn't I have more patience? So it's okay to just be doing the best you can. This last point here says no one is a parenting expert. Most of us feel vulnerable all the time. So in the chat, if you can take a moment and just, do you agree or disagree with some of these points that have been made thus far? Share in the chat so we can review together. Yes, no, some of it, maybe. I see, I agree. Is anybody breathing a sigh of relief? If you're like, oh gosh, that's so good to hear. I kind of feel that way. But sometimes we're reading books or we're watching someone else's life, the snapshot that they post on social media, and it looks so perfect. And you're just like, my child would never sit still and take that picture. I have friends who would post, and sometimes they would go back and say, this was the first picture, and this was the last picture. And it's kind of cool because they show the child just wiggling or running or doing whatever, not cooperating. And then they get like the 12th shot was the one that I wanted to post, but they decide to be vulnerable and be honest and just be like, it's not perfect, people. So I can appreciate that. All right. Thank you guys for sharing in the chat that you agree, and especially the last point. No one is a parenting expert. Most of us feel vulnerable all the time. All right. So here's something that is always good to keep in mind, our parenting style. When it comes to talking about being the perfect parent, we all have different parenting styles. Some of us are more authoritarian, some permissive, uninvolved. And uninvolved may not mean that you're not there. It may mean you're kind of disengaged. You're just like so burned out, so tired that you're just like, here's a little video, play the video for an hour or two so that I can just check out for a minute because I'm so tired. So it doesn't even mean that you're a bad parent necessarily. It just means that for whatever reason, you may have had a really long week at work and you're just tired and worn out. You're not sleeping well at night. Could be a lot of different reasons. You're overcommitted, a lot of different reasons. And then there's the authoritative parent. So just thinking about your parenting style and trying to think, what does that have to do with being a perfect parent, or being an imperfect parent? That's something to think about because, for one, if your parenting style does not line up with what works best for your particular child, especially if you have multiple children, sometimes some things work with one child that doesn't work with the other child. So if you're not able to flex and kind of tweak it a little bit, to see what works best for that child, especially if your child has different abilities. If they're ADHD or autism or any kind of learning challenges or anything like that, or they simply don't sleep at night. There's a whole lot of things that go on when it comes to parenting, and sometimes your parenting style may have to be tweaked according to the child you're dealing with. And then the other part to consider with this parenting style is sometimes we tend to parent the way we are parented. And sometimes people very intentionally don't parent the way their parents parented them because they didn't like it, or they try it with their child and it's like it doesn't work with them. So, as far as this parenting is imperfect, trying to figure out the best way to parent your child is a full-time job. So here's just kind of going again with some points from the books for your consideration. She talks about cultivating wholeheartedness, and she says we cannot give our children what we don't have. In fact, she mentions this quite a few times. We cannot give our children what we don't have. So she talks about, just if you're trying to be vulnerable, if you're trying to create a sense of belonging, if you're trying not to create a space where there's shame, but instead more so guilt where they're learning, like if you yourself don't have that for yourself, it's hard to give that, offer that to your children. So you can be thinking about that as we go through the rest of the presentation. Do I have what I'm trying to give my children for myself? Continuing, it says how we raise our children and how we think about our families and our lives impact our parenting. So, how you think about your life and your children and everything, it impacts you. And this point says, I'm enough no matter what kind of day I have. So, the big point of cultivating wholeheartedness is just to tell yourself, you know what? I'm doing the best I can. I am enough. I had a rough day. I had a good day. No matter what kind of day I have, I am enough. And I am the parent that my child has. So, I get to kind of sit with that for a moment. So, cultivating worthiness in our family is one of the goalposts that she covers in her book, and cultivating worthiness in our family. And she makes the point that worthiness does not have prereqs, but how often do we unintentionally, oftentimes, add prerequisites to worthiness? So, for example, many of us have attached prereqs to worthiness if and when list of worthiness. So you may be unintentionally with your child going, if you tie your shoes, then this. If you clean your room, then this. Or when you learn how to not be so messy, then so you're not intentionally doing it, but if we're not careful, we are attaching worthiness to these things. Like, child, if you do this and when you do this, then you are worthy. Like, that's a message that you're sending, although you're not trying to. But it is about as if. So this is the message we want to send. You're saying, like, this is who you are, this is who I am. I know I'm not perfect. I know you're not perfect. I love you no matter what. And that takes some intentionality. So as parents, the question is, what prereqs for worthiness are we knowingly or unknowingly handing down to our children? Knowingly or unknowingly, what kind of prereqs are we handing down? How many times have you heard yourself say, well, I will do this if you do this? Or when you learn how to, like, so it's unknowingly, but you got to be really careful. So here's one of the keys here. The enemy of worthiness is shame. There's a difference between shame and guilt, which we'll talk about. And what does this look like in your family? What does this look like in your family? Something to think about. Here's the difference between shame and guilt. Shame is the belief that I am bad. I am unworthy of love and belonging. There's something about us we have um, that we have done that renders us unlovable, that we don't deserve to have connection. So that's shame. That's shame. It can be intergenerational parenting style. So basically, you may have been shamed by your parents, and they, again, unknowingly, they weren't probably trying to do it. They shamed you, like saying you're bad, you're messy, you're irresponsible. So the difference in a different way to say that would be to say you're being irresponsible, you're doing irresponsible things, not you're irresponsible. Or you are being messy, not you're messy. So that's the difference. And so the child gets to kind of take that on as an identity. And yet, to someone's point in the chat, that it's hard to unlearn it truly is hard. And in the book, she offers different examples where like, for example, she was talking to her daughter about shame and not being guilty and things like that. Uh, she was trying to coach her on, what to do and what not to do in certain situations. And then she turned around and did something. And her daughter was like, well, Mom, if you like it and everyone else, and it doesn't matter what other people, she was just like, oh my gosh, I just did that. So she shares lots of great examples of trying to live this out in her own family and how difficult it is. So, another point, children experience shame as the threat of being unlovable. So it's not difficult to use shame to turn their behaviors around. And with that point, she was saying, look, oftentimes we use shame to try to turn their behavior around, but we should not use shame in that way. And again, you haven't even defined it as shame. It's just what you're doing. And maybe because that's what you were was done to you when you were growing up. So you're just like, why are you so messy? Stop being so messy. And then you may attach some kind of value to it. Like nobody's going to want to hang out with you if you're messy all the time. Whoa, you talk about shame. Or you can't go anywhere with me if you don't get your room clean. Whoa, you just attach some value to shame. Not intentionally again, unknowingly, but you did. And so now the child is like, well, I can't go anywhere unless I gotta always have my room clean. I gotta be perfect and all this kind of stuff. And so you just kind of, it's just really interesting. And so the big difference in saying, I love who you are, but these choices and these behaviors are not acceptable. So that's what we're really going for. We're trying to say that these behaviors or these choices that you're making are unacceptable, but I still love you. Like that's what we're really trying to say, but sometimes that is not what the child hears or feels or experiences. Parenting is about making a journey with our children. It's about learning and growing alongside them, especially when it comes to shame resilience. So we're trying to create, build children that are shame resilient. So she gives an example in the book where she says her daughter was shamed. Her daughter was at school, like I think she said kindergarten or something like that. And the teacher said, "Oh, you're so messy. You've been so messy." And she said the daughter said, "I may be making a mess, but I'm not messy," to the teacher, right? And so the teacher talks to her later about it and says, "This is what happened." And so she's like, "Oh goodness, But it was good that that daughter, she had already been instilling in her that your mess is not you. Like you're making a mess, but you're not messy. And so the daughter was able to, when she was outside of her parents' space, correct this other adult, basically not take that on. And another point she makes in the book is that even though in your household you may be trying to instill, a sense of I love you no matter what, I'm not maybe happy with the choices and the behaviors, but that is not you. But I need you to work on that behavior and that choice, right? But she was saying your child will leave your space and they will interact with other family and friends and coaches and teachers and whomever they're around, neighborhood, whatever. And they may be getting it from those spaces. And so, if we don't teach our children that you are more than enough, you are smart, you are this, you are that, you may not have done a smart thing in this decision, then they don't know how to deal with that when they're not around us. So, that was another point, just kind of the importance of teaching them how to deal with these things when they're not around us. And so, here's the guilt part. So, we just talked about shame. Shame says, I am bad. I am not worthy. I am, that shame. It just kind of beats you down. Guilt is what we're really going for. So she said, guilt is when basically you feel the consequences of your behavior. Like you recognize that that wasn't a good thing that you did, but you know that you're not bad. So guilt is, I've done something bad. Great girl, really bad choice. Like that was the example she gave. Like I've done something bad, but I'm not bad. I'm still awesome, but that was not my smartest decision. So being able to separate that allows them to maintain a good, healthy self-esteem and self-concept, but they don't like walk around with their shoulders hunched over and like looking at the ground and won't look at people. There's all kinds of nonverbal behaviors that you oftentimes will see in children that's walking around with this shame on them. And you may see it in your own child. Just watch them. How do they interact with others? How do they interact with you? When you start like scolding them about something, do they hold their head down? That's probably kind of normal. But then do you give them a hug after, like, look, I still love you. You're awesome, but I just don't like when you do that. And that is not a good way to do, just kind of explain you're always enough is the big point, right? So guilt. As parents, we want children that rely heavily on guilt self-talk rather than shame self-talk. So guilt self-talk can be like, oh my gosh, Zeta, why did you do that? That was not a good decision. You know you needed more time to do that. Like that's me saying, okay, check yourself, right? The shame version of that would be like, you are so stupid. You are so irresponsible. Like nobody can depend on you. Like that would be the shame version of the same conversation. So she talked also about how we as parents, our children are always watching us. And so we have to make sure that we are not displaying in our own self-talk, shame talk, like making sure we're saying, oh, I forgot to do that. Oh my gosh, I should make a list next time and just move on versus You are so stupid. You're always forgetting things. Nobody can ever depend on you. You always, I mean, like that's a whole different conversation, right? So she gives an example of her daughter when she was telling her daughter not to feel shame because of something that happened at school. And then she was cooking and she dropped like a utensil and she was like, "Oh, you're so stupid," to herself. Like, and her daughter was in earshot and was like, "What are you saying? You're so stupid." And kind of called her out on it. And so she was like, "Oh my gosh, I did the same thing I'm telling you not to do to yourself." So we as parents, we also have to be mindful of not shame talking ourselves. And then, of course, your children are observing that if you do. Parenting is a strong predictor of rather some whether someone will show up being more shame or more guilt prone. Here's some examples. How we are talking to our children, and the tricky part is, how we talk to our children also will kind of determine if they kind of show up in the world as being a shame-prone person or a guilt-prone person. How we engage with our own shame, that's back to the do you shame yourself? Do you feel shame yourself? Are you self-talking in that way? Your example is more powerful than what they see you do is more powerful and impactful than anything you say. So that was a big point she was making too. Like, although we're saying, okay, help your child develop this guilt talk, not shame talk. Guilt being like, I made a decision, shame being, I am terrible. That's different. But also, you can say that to them all day, but if they watch you do something completely different, it's not very impactful. Any questions or comments at this point before we move on? You can put it in the chat or feel free to unmute yourself and share if you like. There's a comment in the chat that says praising good things is sometimes more important than criticizing bad behavior. Yes. And that makes me think of the comment, or I guess the advice that says praise what you want to see. So if you want to see them, clean up more or make their bed every morning or whatever, the 2 mornings that they do it, be like, wow, you did an awesome job making your bed today. Just make a point to say that even though the other mornings you wanted to say, oh my gosh, you didn't make your bed, just maybe don't. Try that out for a couple of weeks and see how it goes. See if they make their bed more often because they want that praise. They want that high five. You did it. Yay. All right. No comments. I take it. Let's move on to vulnerability. So with vulnerability, this book, again, the book is called The Gifts of Imperfect Parenting. Um, she talks a lot about how important it is if we can be vulnerable with our children and vulnerable in our homes because she says imperfect parenting is a gift. So being vulnerable is you being imperfect in front of your children. This is you showing them that it's okay not to have it all together all the time. Like no one does. I don't. The world, people don't, right? And so the way that they learn it's okay to be vulnerable, it's okay to be human, is by watching you and how you are okay when things, and you share stories with them. So if you have a bad day and something happened and you just did not like the way that meeting went and you didn't like the fact that whatever didn't work out for you in a situation, you having a challenging conversation with a friend and they just misunderstood what you were saying and it really hurt your feelings, like things like that. If you're vulnerable with your children, you let them know, oh, it's okay to be imperfect. I don't have to put on a show and pretend like everything is okay all the time. I don't have to smile when I really want to cry. Like I know you guys have all seen that commercial and it's talking about depression where the lady has like a sign, like a smiley face, where she's sitting, she's walking around and she holds up the smiling face. And it's oftentimes how some of us react and behave in the world. And now obviously we know as adults you have to shield some things, right? But the point here is like teach your child how to be vulnerable and create a safe space in your home and with you where they can be vulnerable, where they can say, I failed at that test. I tried so hard, or I got a C and I was really aiming for an A, and I don't know why the teacher didn't like my art piece. And it really hurt my feelings when they said whatever. And then she said, you oftentimes also, when it comes to vulnerability, as parents, we want to jump in and save the day. We want to jump in and say, it'll be okay. You got that. Sometimes there's a space to not like praise. There's a space to just let your child get that out of their system and talk about how their feelings are hurt when their friends didn't play with them or didn't invite them to the party, and just be like, I'm sorry. That sounds like that really hurt your feelings. I'm so sorry about that. And just stop. And she talked about how it's difficult to do that because as parents, so often, but we're teaching them to be vulnerable when we allow them to sit with that. So that was kind of the big point she was making. Let them sit with it for a little bit. Because when you do, they're learning to be vulnerable. And they're learning that it's okay to be vulnerable. It's okay to process these feelings. It's okay to have these emotions. And sometimes life is just you have a bad day or whatever. And it's okay. You will be okay. So it's really interesting point, like not to rescue them. Let them feel it. Let them know you're there for them. Give them a hug. Listen. So that's a good point. So here's her definition of vulnerability: uncertainty, risk, and emotional exposure. Uncertainty, risk, and emotional exposure. So the most profound moments that we share with our children happen in vulnerability. So back to the beginning when we were talking about being imperfect. Sometimes that's the most powerful, meaningful moments you have with your children when you're not perfect. And it could be something as simple as you were cooking something and you drop the plate on the floor and you're like, oh my gosh. And you just laugh about it or whatever, or you're like upset about it, whatever you're feeling, they just observe how you respond to that. And then you clean it up and you move on. So they like, oh, it's okay to make a mistake. Like you don't have to be happy about it, but you can live with it. You'll be okay. The moments that shape who we are and who they are happen in vulnerability. When we show up together, take off our mask, and we are completely able to see and hear one another, when we feel safe enough to show up, that's vulnerability. Show up who we are, no mask. When children see vulnerability and not perfection in their parents, they tend to be good at it when they become adults. So you're like planting seeds for them as they get older. They know they saw how you responded when things didn't go right. They saw how you responded when everything wasn't perfect. And they think it's okay to respond that way. They don't have to be perfect. They don't have to put on a show. They don't have to be fake. They don't have to they can be authentically themselves. It's important to let your children see you struggle and work through it. These people tend to be comfortable with uncertainty and discomfort. So, children that have seen you work through things, they're more likely to be comfortable with uncertainty and discomfort when they see it growing up. They have a good sense of who they are and are okay with discomfort. When you see your children struggle, we want to fix it. That's the point I was just making earlier. Sometimes we need to just let them sit with the struggle. We need to fight the urge to fix it. Instead, sit with them and acknowledge the struggle. Don't try to fix it and make ourselves more comfortable. I thought it was a really interesting point where she was saying, oftentimes when we're trying to fix it, we're really sometimes trying to make ourselves more comfortable. Like we're trying to move past that moment. Like we don't want to deal with it. We don't want to experience it. It's like it's tough on us to watch our child cry. It's tough on us to watch them be uncomfortable or struggling with something. So we just want to fix it. So that's a really interesting point. Don't try to fix it to make ourselves more comfortable. Something to think about. More points about vulnerability. How often do you share your own struggles with your children? Let them see you work through it, through the disappointment. When we, excuse me, when we are willing to be vulnerable with our children, we give them the opportunity to practice empathy and compassion towards us. Thought that was really interesting as well. And she shares an example of, where that happened in her family. where she's already like shown by example that it's okay to be vulnerable and be there for people. So then when she had a tough moment, situation happened, she she got that from her child. Her child was like, "Oh, mom, I understand exactly how that feels." And so the child, she had just did that with the child previously, not too long before that, and now that child was giving it back to her. So that was a really interesting point. They learn, so it was reminding us that our children do learn how to be vulnerable, how to be imperfect through us. And that is it's okay. And so that's why, again, the book is called The Gifts of Imperfect Parenting. Like there's some gifts here. There's some rewards here. All right. Be willing to own the emotions and help them own their own emotions. So you own yours, it helps them to own theirs. How often do you share? And then she talked about, the importance of sharing age appropriate things. That's kind of a given, but I thought it was a good point to make. Like we're not saying share things with them that they can't deal with, that is not appropriate for them to even be trying to process. Certain struggles we know are adult struggles, and you just need to keep that with talking to an adult. So she wasn't saying that. She was just saying making sure whatever you share and whatever vulnerability, you choose to, like maybe you may share a story, but not all the details of a story, for example. Just keeping it age appropriate. So here's a point. Have you ever said, I don't care what other anybody thinks? Can it really matter? Can it really not matter? When we really stop caring about what people think, we lose our capacity for connection. That was super interesting to me. She was just saying, like, you know what? It's important to care what other people think. Not to the point of, and she made the distinction, not to the point of crippling and dependency on what people think about you. Not like you can't make a decision because it's going to upset somebody or people are not going to like you, not to that degree. But she was saying we keep a connection with almost like society with people when there's a little bit of I do care how I come across in the world. I do care how I come across at work. I do care the image, the character, reputation that I have. I do care about that. So, and part of being vulnerable, but she was saying sometimes people kind of go a little farther out than they need to, and they were like, I don't care what anybody think. And it's kind of a coping defense mechanism. Like you really do probably care, but it's just something to think about. Love and belonging. Love and belonging. She's love and belonging is a birthright. So back to this, teaching your child about the gifts of imperfect parenting. You want to make sure that you're like, you know what? You are loved and you belong here in this family. It is your birthright. You were born into this family, or you were adopted into this family, or fostered into this family. However you got here, um, y we love you and you belong. And there's nothing you can do, nothing that can happen that will change that. So it is not on the table when I am in struggle. I'm not going to see you differently. When you're in struggle, I'm not going to see you differently. So she talks about the fact that what we need most from our families is love and belonging. And love is something we nurture and grow, and we can only love others as much as we love ourselves. So it goes back to the earlier point where she was like, you can't give what you don't have. So, as parents, we're trying to give this gift of being imperfect to our children, this gift of being vulnerable, this gift of worthiness, that you're always worthy and nothing will make you not be worthy. But if we don't have those things for yourself, it's hard to give that to your children. So, thinking about belonging. Belonging is an innate human desire to be a part of something that is larger than us. I love that definition that she shared. We often try to acquire this by fitting in and seeking approval. This is a hollow sense of belonging and often barriers to belonging. True belonging only happens when we present our authentic and imperfect selves to the world. Our sense of belonging can never be greater than our level of self-acceptance. That's a key to this particular category, love and belonging. Our sense of belonging can never be greater than our level of self-acceptance. And then she just makes the point that, in terms of human needs and desires, fitting in is the primary barrier to belonging, like trying to fit in. Show up, be real, be authentic, let others see you. I like this quote that says, a strong relationship with a parent can provide children with a sense of security and belonging, helping them to feel supported as they navigate the obstacles of growing up. Navigate the obstacles of growing up. So, having a strong relationship with a parent can provide them with a sense of security or longing, love and belonging. And here's a question for you, just to think about. If you had a special connection with an adult when you were a child, what was it about that relationship that made you feel special? So, thinking about this gift of imperfect parenting, and we're trying to instill in our children a sense of worthiness, and we want them to do guilt talk, not shame talk. Know it's okay to be vulnerable, know that they are loved and belong. Was there an adult in your life? Put that in the chat if you don't mind. If was there an adult in your life that you had a special connection with, and what was it about that relationship that made you feel special? You can just put the adult name or title or category. You don't have to answer the other part in the chat. But when I look at this question, it makes me think about my grandfather who actually died when I was 11, very, very long time ago. My dad was the 11th child of 12. So by the time he had children, his parents were pretty far in age already. But I loved my grandfather, and I remember him so well, even though I was 11 when he died, because I had such a connection to him. He was there, he was present, he was engaged. He listened a lot, you know. And so that's just an example. Someone just said an aunt who they said they saw you. Yes, I love that. The aunt who praised who you were and felt like they saw you. That's good. Praised who you were. And that's what we're all seeking, right? We're all wanting to be seen and accepted just the way we are. Just the way we are. So this is just a nice reminder that we do have this session coming up in February, be a three-part series talking in more in depth with this book. Feel free to, hopefully, you can get the audiobook and listen to it a couple times between now and then and join in. And we're going to break it down a little bit more, and it'll be more kind of discussion style, more pausing and letting you talk and small groups and things like that for those three parts, that three-part series. This was kind of a snapshot, and we did not cover the entire book in this session. It was just kind of a quick highlight and just a introduction to it, so to speak. And I just want to kind of remind you that we're talking about progress, not perfection. When we're talking about this whole gift of imperfect parenting, like if you can just strive to make some progress in these categories we just talked about, this category of cultivating a wholehearted sense of worthiness in your home and your family, this category of shame, keeping in mind what the difference is between shame and guilt, instilling and bringing about love and belonging, being vulnerable, teaching your child what that means and how that can enrich their lives. I would say this is a good thing to do. Just kind of take it one day at a time and being mindful and kind of see what, observe for yourself how things are going in your family and catch yourself. If you catch yourself, you're just making progress. Well, thank you guys for being here today. I really appreciate your time and energy and attention, and I wish you a fabulous day.